Folks, so in this video, we're going to be looking at the core muscles and with a focus on respiration or breathing. And we're going to be looking as an overview of both the inner unit and the outer unit. For your reference, we're using the yoga app in Muscle and Motion. It's a great learning tool. We're in the core asana section. We're in the theory section. So if you want to find this, if you want to follow along, if you have that app at home. So let me just maximize it here. All right, so just a quick overview, and then the next video we'll look into the practical actions of these breathing muscles. So we have all these muscles here are the different units of the body. So we have inner unit, which comprises of the erector spinae muscles, so the multifidi. These are these long, thin muscles that go, they're segmental. So for example, this one here is on the sacrum, and it goes up past L5 onto L4. So this one here starts at the base of the sacrum as well and goes up to L3, L2. So they kind of throughout the spine, and they create a lot of the kind of rotation and stabilization of the back of the spinal muscles. We have transverse abdominis, which is wrapping around. You can see by the horizontal fibers. We have the diaphragm, which is often overlooked as one of the key, even though it's the primary respiratory muscle, it's also a big stabilizer because it's attached onto the spine. And we also then have the pelvic floor muscles as well. So this is typically called the inner unit, where the outer unit, here we have, get my mug out of the way. We have the bigger muscles of the back. So here we have the erector spinae group. So the kind of erector spinae, the iliac costalis, and we have then the oblique muscles coming through here. There would also be the quadratus lumborum. And if you flip around from the front, you'll also have the rectus abdominis on the front and the other oblique muscles. So looking at the inner unit first, 2, 4. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, the 4 key areas. So multifidi, diaphragm, transverse abdominis, and we have then the pelvic floor muscle. So just go back a little bit, get rid of those numbers. So what happens when you breathe in is that the respiratory diaphragm here is going to flatten down. So this dome flattens down. And then all the abdominal contents in here get pushed inferiorly. So they get pushed downward because this diaphragm is going to move from this position downward like that. At the same time as this diaphragm is contracting and pushing down, the pelvic diaphragm here is going to match that movement, and it's going to eccentrically lengthen. So these muscles are going to lengthen so that they're contracting. So they're still maintaining stabilization, but they're going to contract. At the same time, there is typically an extension of the spine. So you're going to get an anterior tilt and a little bit of lumbar lordosis or lumbar extension coming through here. And that just gives space for the abdominals, for the viscera to get kind of compressed down. So that all happens on the inhale. And then on the exhale, it will reverse. So the pelvic floor muscles will contract. So one way to think about that is the two ischial tuberosities getting pulled towards each other, not sucking up. So if you look at the kind of line of these muscles here, they're more horizontal. So when they contract, there's definitely a feeling of lifting up from the pelvic floor, but you're not sucking up. Then at the same time, the pelvis is going to rotate into a bit more of a posterior tilt. The transverse abdominis is going to contract. So it's going to stabilize. And then the diaphragm is going to dome back up to its resting position up to here. The multifidi in this kind of exhalation phase is stabilizing the spine. So that's the natural functional action of the inner unit. Now, when you're doing exercise and you want to brace, depending on the exercise you're doing and the technique you want to employ, you just basically want to really think about this pattern of movement that's happening in the inner unit. So if you're lifting heavy weights or you're going into a particular posture or stance which requires a lot of stabilization. What you would do is you take a little inhale and then you would exhale through the nose or through the pursed lips, which creates a little bit of pressure. And then that pressure means that the airway is a bit more restricted, so you have to push the air out. And so the way the blade does that is it contracts the T transverse abdominis, which compresses in, which pushes up, which pushes the air out, and that creates a stabilization. So you want that little brace, that little brace, and then you keep that brace engaged. Then you take your second inhale and then perform the movement. So that's how you would engage your core muscles when you are breathing if you're doing resistance training. Now, depending on the technique and what you're doing with training, that becomes really intuitive. You don't really need to think about too much. If you're not used to that type of breathing, it can be quite difficult to train. And it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around because these muscles are designed to be contracting at a low intensity. So like 10, 20% of their contractional potential. So there's still movement there. There's still some stabilization. Of course, the stronger you squeeze, the stronger you contract, the more stabilization, the less movement through the spine is going to occur. So there's always a bit of a give and take depending on the movement. So if you're doing big end range of movement where you need the pelvis to roll through anterior, posterior tilt, you want enough stabilization that the movement's controlled, but not too much that everything's locked in and you can't move. Okay. So there's a bit of a nuance to it. So for example, if you're doing a squat, what you do, maybe doing like a double rack kettlebell squat, so 2 kettlebells resting in the rack position, you would bring them up into the rack, you would take a little breath in, you would breathe out, brace the core, put it on, then squat down on the inhale, and then as you exhale, you'd squat up, and then because on the exhale, the pelvic floor engages, transverse abdominis engages, and the outer unit engages a lot, you're stable at the bottom, and as you're exerting force pushing up, so you're going to be in a really strong position, and then you press up on the effort on the exhalation phase, or typically the hardest part. And as you're coming up, you'll go into a slight pelvic tilt, which will probably coming back more into neutral position, and then that'll engage the anterior core pelvic floor as well, and that mimics the natural exhalation phase as you're coming up. So one thing to kind of think about it, if you get confused, is if you're throwing a ball, okay, do you throw a ball when you breathe in or when you breathe out? You can just try it. So just get any kind of ball, doesn't matter. It could be a tennis ball, or a cricket ball, or a basketball, and just throw it, okay? And then throw it while you're breathing in, and then try to throw it when you're breathing out. And you'll find that you can throw it when you're breathing in because you can kind of override these patterns, but it's really, really uncomfortable, okay? So exhale usually is the effort. Now we look at the outer unit, so we'll just get through here these again. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Skip through this, and we get a nice side view here. So we've got a deep multifidi, and we'll just scroll through. Diaphragm, transverse abdominis, pelvic floor. And this is a nice little diagram. So this kind of contains the inner unit. So when you are braced, you have this kind of 360-degree direction of engagement. So the diaphragm is bracing, the TVA is bracing, and the pelvic floor is bracing, and the erector spinae here as well. So you've got the thoracic cavity separated by the diaphragm into the abdominal cavity. So all these abdominal contents are compressed into the spine, which is what you want. So the diaphragm, because it attaches onto the spine, can become a really powerful stabilizer of the middle and lower back. And that's a big problem if that becomes a primary stabilizer and it's not working in concert with the other abdominal muscle. Then you get a really dysfunctional lower back and dysfunctional breathing pattern. And that can kind of all kinds of problems for people's biomechanics. Okay. So cool. Let's go to the outer unit. So here we have the outer unit. So we've got the rectus abdominis, big muscle, coming up halfway up to the rib cage. All right, so around it, just below your pec muscle typically, and then it goes right down to the pubic symphysis. Then we've got our obliques. So this is more internal obliques, this is more external obliques coming through here. And then on the back, you'll have quadratus lumborum as well. So these are the movement muscles. So these are the ones that create like the sit-up movement or the spinal flexion, the side bending or lateral flexion, or twisting or the rotation movements. So these are the ones that are designed to move the body. The inner units are designed to really stabilize the body, and they work together in like a synchronistic way. Okay. So the goal of core training is to be able to like engage your core, and then also move your spine. So the spine has 6 ways it moves. So it's flexion and extension, so forward bending and straightening up, side bending, left to right. That's 3. Then we have rotation, left to right. 4. We have what we call anti-rotation, where it's like you lift up a weight and then you're stopping the body from twisting out of a line. That's 5. And then you have neutral spine, so where you're keeping everything nice and braced and nice and stiff. And that is kind of stabilization. So a good core training program needs to train all 6 of those movements. So that's what you're kind of trying to aim to do. In breathing, okay, that's great image. So in breathing, the internal oblique is going to, on the inhale, inspiration is going to eccentrically lengthen depending on where you are in space. Okay, so it's not really active on the inhalation phase. It needs to be relaxed enough that it's going to allow the ribs to extend out to allow the diaphragm to compress down. Okay, but on the exhale, it's very, very important because it's going to pull these ribs down, and that helps facilitate the diaphragm to dome back up. So your internal obliques, IOs, really, really important on exhalation. And often people get a lower back pain because they get a slight rotation compensation. Typically one side of their core, one internal oblique is really, really weak. And so they don't get that depression of the ribs. So they struggle to exhale and depress that rib. If you can't depress the ribs, then you can't really get a really strong stabilization of the core itself. So it's a really, really key thing. We need that rib down, rib down, rib down. Here we have external obliques coming up more in this angle, and then the rectus abdominis. So depending on your position, if you're doing like a sit-up kind of forward flexion, they all work together in a team. If you're doing rotation, then you're going to get internal oblique on one side, external oblique on the other side. If you're doing lateral flexion, it's purely one side working, the other side stretches out. So depending on your position is where you are going to get these muscles recruited. But you should be able to breathe in any position that you do. So for example, if you laterally flex, if you bring this rib cage to this top of the pelvis here, the ilium, okay, so that's all contracted here. Reciprocal inhibition was going to relax and open up the other side. This is really helpful too, because that's also going to stretch the quadratus lumborum, so your lower back muscle. So one way we stretch the lower back is to work on actually getting the core muscle strong, because we want that reciprocal balance. If this left IO or this right IO was weak, okay, it's typically going to mean either the same IO, same QL on that side is going to be overcompensating to stabilize, because it's going to be helping doing lateral flexion and stabilization laterally, or depending on what's going on the pelvis, you might be the other side that's kind of compensated, and so you'll get like this kind of like tilting position, and that'll kind of change the position of the pelvis as well. And that's a muscular compensation. So when you rebalance those 2 muscles, then you can breathe correctly, and then you can move correctly as well. So in my kind of method, the way I train people is core training is breathing, and breathing is core training. So you want to really be able to kind of understand the real importance of abdominal work or core training and respiration, because it all works together as one unit. Okay, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop a message down in the comments, etc. And in the next video, we're going to look at some of the actual actions of these muscles as you're breathing in and as you're breathing out. So we'll see you then.